It was during a surprise test on genetics in her biology class that Connie realized that her father would have turned 50 today, if he was still alive. She had just answered a question on inheritance when she happened to look down at the date on the bottom right corner of the sheet. The thought hit her on seeing the numbers, and she did her best to put it out of her mind, to try to concentrate on answering the questions in front of her. But the thought was alive now, and would not be banished. She started to etch her face on the margins of the page. It was her face she was drawing, in fine blue biro lines. Her Aunt Tasha always said of her that she had her father's features, and it was true that when she looked at a photograph of him, she recognized as her own the strong, square jaw and the slightly oversized ears that she hated about herself. But she had also inherited her mother's thick blonde hair and large mouth. She also hated this about herself. Her mouth was too big, her lips were too full, her teeth protruded. That was why she rarely smiled in photographs. She turned the page and tried to concentrate on the series of diagrams, charts, and data detailing the frequency of respiratory illness in 4 generations of human twins. She had to evaluate both the genetic and environmental factors in the inheritance of disease. Again, her eyes kept straying to her father's birth date on the bottom right-hand corner of the page. But she forced herself to focus and soon enough was finished. She leaned back in her chair. Behind her, Jenna had finished as well. "How'd you go?" "All right," whispered Connie, furiously looking over to where Mr. DeSantis was standing. He had his hands behind his back and was staring out of the window. What could he be looking at? The empty basketball court? Her eyes drifted across to the clock next to the whiteboard. 10 minutes to go. He was probably as bored as she was. 10 minutes, 600 seconds, left before the bell rang. Beside her, Nick Cerces was still frantically writing out his answers in his rough scrawl. His tongue was sticking out of one corner of his mouth. He looked feverish, anxious. He was one of the best students in her year, but unlike herself, it did not come easy to Nixie. He wasn't naturally smart. Everything was an effort for him. He was now scratching at his mop of unruly red hair, sending flickers of dandruff onto the paper and across his desk. He must have played football over lunch. She meant soccer, but she had never been able to bring herself to call the sport by its Australian name, and he smelt of a boy, a pungent male stink. She fought back the urge to lean over and whisper an answer. DeSantis had turned and was facing the class, his hands still behind his back, probably still bored. 431, 430. She would not think of Hector. She would not think of Hector. She wished she hadn't finished so quickly. 126, 125. She did not give up on her backwards count, and when the bell finally did ring it gave her a jolt. DeSantis walked up and down the aisles of desks, picking up the tests. Chairs scraped back. Everyone rushed to the door. Jenna had earphones in and was scrolling through her iPod. Most of the students were checking their mobile phones or already shouting into them as they pushed into the hallway. Connie was still at her desk, slowly packing her bag. Nick hadn't moved and he looked over to her with a sad, puzzled smile. "That was hard," he lied. He was rocking back and forth on his chair, his hands behind his head. There were dark sweat stains on the armpits of his white school shirt. The sight offended her. "See ya!" She swung her bag over her shoulder and marched out. The tram was packed with school kids from her school, the girls' school up the road, the Catholic boys' school, and she and Richie pushed their way through the crowd and sat on the dirty steps of the emergency exit. Richie was leaning his elbows on the sports bag on his lap. He was humming a song. "Hey, faggot, shut it." Richie fell silent immediately and slumped over his bag. Connie turned around and gave Ali the finger. His dark, sharp-featured face broke into a grin. He simulated motions of oral sex. "Gross!" She turned away in disgust. "He's such a pig!" she called out loudly. She could hear Ali and his mate Costa laughing behind her, but she pretended not to hear them. Richie still looked hurt, but suddenly he straightened up and winked at her, leaning across to whisper in her ear. "Yeah, but he's such a sexy pig." It still shocked her to hear him say things like that. She tried not to show her discomfort. "You reckon?" "Don't you?" "No way." She shivered in mock horror. "He's a totally sexist creep." She screwed up her face and pretended to vomit. Richie started to rock back and forth with laughter. His loud chortle rang through the tram. "Faggot, you sound like a fucking horse." An old woman sitting behind him coughed and then said something sharp in Arabic. That shut Ali up.